Alright, so we're going to cover molten metal safety today. This pertains to the Clarksville and Stony Creek facilities. And right off the bat, we're going to jump into just a very quick but very important video about the importance of wearing your PPE and wearing it properly whenever you're working directly with molten metal.
Some of our remelt operators have a long history with molten metal.
My great-grandfather retired at remelt. My grandpa retired at the South End, and my dad also retired at remelt.
My grandfather was hotline foreman, and my dad and all his brothers were remelt employees.
The old stories don't all have happy endings.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard
Horrible scenario.
horror stories of aluminum blowing up in people's faces and going up their nose and having to pull out their name. Solidified aluminum, and it looks like there's sinus cavity or people getting it going down their throat, and then there's throat swells. Well, then I've heard stories from my father and grandfather that they'd have to pull them out and stick sticks down their throat to keep them from swelling shut, to keep them alive. And
I can't even count, probably a dozen or more. You know, yeah, it's just one of those things where you just see it. Back then, you usually used to have at least a blow up once a week back when I first started. I mean, there was one blow up on DC6 that I always remember. The guy had a sweatshirt on. By the time we got to him, his meat from his arm was just hanging, you know, and it lots and lots of skin grafts. He went through a lot of pain and suffering on that. So, I mean, like I said, there's been so many of them, I couldn't even tell you how.
The saying goes that if we fail to learn from history, we're destined to repeat it.
I was standing maybe on top of the hill pan itself, on the grate that separates the hill pan from where we work. And I was standing on it, and I kind of was turned to my left side with my right side facing it. And as I broke it, I'm holding the pendulum for the crane to lift up the trough.
And right when metal started filling up in there, it just blew on us. And I mean, my face was over the top of it, and Jeremy was
Luckily looking at it.
Yeah, looking right at it, and he got hit from the side.
I remember staring down at it and watching it fill up, and then just hearing an explosion, feeling it hit me, and going, oh crap. And that's all I remember, going, oh crap, feeling it hit me, blast me backwards. And then I remember coming up out of the pit, screaming and ripping all my gear off. But I don't really remember anything in between.
Probably 200-300 pounds of metal just got thrown everywhere. Oh, very far.
It hit the ceiling.
It hit the ceiling, so.
And then about probably a 50, 75 foot circle radius, it sprayed out.
It covered our whole pit, and there's metal in places you didn't think there should be metal.
It looked like it had snowed almost, yeah. Just a silver snow on the floor.
So, you know, I wanted to make sure he was all right, and I from the sound of it, it didn't sound like he was. And then, you know, I didn't know if I was all right, you know, because it's that metal. I'm wearing all of my gear, and when it's raining on you, the impact and the heat still hurts. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's peppering you everywhere, and it's
like getting hail. We're running out in a hailstorm, just hot, not cold.
Hot hailstorm. Yeah. Couple minor burns.
Yeah.
Not bad though. I had 2 on my arm, on my forearm. No scars. They left marks the night of, but that was about it. Yeah.
I was lucky. Nothing for me.
Yeah.
I truly believe that if we weren't wearing our face shields, that it would have been one of us down there like that.
Yeah. Ooh, if my face shield would have been up, I'd probably still be getting skin grafts on my face. It was, I believe you had yours up to talk back. Because, I mean, when you have that face shield down, you just can't hear anybody, and it's pretty loud out in the mill. So, I mean, we both had our face shields up talking to each other, then right back down. Just, I don't know if it's habit or what, but the timing was good.
They could either be maimed or it was bad enough they could have been killed if they hadn't been wearing PPE.
This goes to prove it's life-saving or badly burned for the rest of their lives.
The PPE is for their protection. It works. We have proof that it does work.
The question for today is, what have we learned along the way that will protect us?
No matter how good you think you are, no matter how good you think your training is, you can get better. I've come to believe that even when I think we're doing well, we're doing excellent, we can always get better, and something can always happen. Even when you're following the rules, things can happen.
I'm going to make sure everything's hot. I learned not to assume anything anymore, that everything's ready to go, and make sure, double check it for myself, because I got family and I want to go back home to them every night.
Probably do all my own setup. As far as on a fresh startup, I'll tear it down. If it takes a couple hours,
A little more work.
I'll tear it down and do the work. And
You have to know the condition of all of your equipment at a startup. Yes, personally, not something somebody told you. It's not a pass down from the previous shift. You have to verify. Verification. You can't say it enough. But not just providing the PPE, but getting people to use it. Even as recent as 2 years ago, I would say 25% of the casting employees complied with the PPE policy. When it comes to compliance to any of the policies regarding safety, especially molten metal safety, we have to do what we have to do to get compliance. I went through lots of coaching, mentoring, persuading, begging. I did it all to try to get guys to comply. And at some point you even have to go the route of discipline and uncomfortable things like that, but you have to do what you have to do to get there.
It took a good probably year to get these guys saying, hey, we got to wear this,
There's a time and a place for everything when it comes to trying to get that compliance. Don't be afraid to do the uncomfortable part, because in the end, you're going to save somebody's life.
All drain and skim pans and sound molds are inspected for the presence of moisture and rust prior to each use. Drain pans, sound molds are preheated to greater than 250 degrees Fahrenheit if the pan mold falls below 250 degrees Fahrenheit during normal and continuous operations. Outages, extended casting unit downtime, weekend shutdowns, or even a skip shift require special evaluation and pan treatment, heating or oiling, prior to casting operations being restarted. If preheating is not possible, then the drain pan sound mold is oiled with mineral oil or similar. It must be emphasized during training that materials used as a separating agent for drain pans or sound molds do not provide protection against explosions. Also, explosions are more probable if the coatings are not dried thoroughly or if they become contaminated with moisture after drying, because the moisture cannot be removed well with air drying. A skim pan or drain pan with a crack greater than 1/8 inch wide must be taken out of service for repair or scrapping. Floor sweepings, trash, debris are not deposited in any drain pan or sound mold that is intended or staged to accept molten aluminum. Refer to the corporate molten metal safety standard for further details. And
Wear your PPE.
Yeah, it's last line of defense, and you hope you never have to use it.
Maybe hot and maybe sweaty, but
Yeah.
it's a lot better than going to the hospital with burns.
Yeah.
I mean,
When you do get blasted, it does its job.
you don't have time to react. It happens so quick. I mean, that explosion literally hit us within, I can't even, it's so quick that there wouldn't be no time to even flick your head to flip that face shield down or anything.
I think the guys on the floor happily were prepared for it.
if we fail to learn from the past, we're destined to repeat it.
There's always somebody that thinks they know better than you, or maybe they just think that it'll never happen to them. And I think Jeremy and Danny can attest to the fact that it will happen to you. It's just a matter of when.
Alright, so a pretty good video there, and that hits close to home for me. My first safety job back in Oklahoma at a steel mill, I worked there for 4 years, and then about 3 years after I left, 2 employees that I knew were unfortunately killed in a molten metal explosion. A very tragic situation. So yeah, you see these old black and white pictures, but this stuff still happens to this day. And you can see the potential for the devastation in these pictures here as well. And of course, you know, this is talking about molten aluminum, but molten zinc, a lot of the same characteristics, pretty much the same stuff here. Let's see, moving on. Here's a picture, and it looks like the same situation that we saw in the video just now, where the employees are trying to fill up a drain pan, and perhaps that drain pan had not been preheated well enough, or maybe there was some moisture in that drain pan, and that's what caused the explosion, it seems. Here's an Alcoa plant in Maryville, Tennessee, where ice got on top of the pigs, and it was introduced into the furnace, and then that ice was submerged suddenly, and that's what caused the explosion in that furnace. So I think this is a test question here. Molten metal explosion event is defined as any time molten metal or solid charged material leaves its designed space within a container, or when molten metal is launched into the air as a result of a steam or a chemical reaction. And this is what is also known as a pop. And make sure that we report all molten metal explosion events and spills. We want to always try to learn from those. We treat those as near misses. So if we report those, then we can look at what happened and try to prevent those from happening ever again. Some quick stuff again on the PPE, the safety glasses, hard hat, steel-toed boots, the long sleeve work shirts, and of course your pants whenever you're working around those furnaces, or pretty much on the floor in general if there's the presence of molten metal. And then it says there additional PPE can be used when interacting with molten metal directly, and that's the thick cotton gloves, could be the leather gloves as well, or the Kevlar type gloves like you saw in the video. Face shield needs to be on the hard hat, and when you're working directly with molten metal, of course, that face shield needs to be in the down position, as we saw in the video. And then here at Clarksville, they've done a really good job at using these protective sleeves for their forearms, and that also helps to provide a seal between the work shirt and the glove, because I did work a recordable case a couple of years ago where molten aluminum actually shot up a worker's sleeve and then rolled back down into his glove, and he required some skin grafts for that. And if he had his sleeves on, his protective sleeves, that would have made a seal, and that probably would have protected him. So we have to keep in mind that work shirts have to be buttoned to about the second button, not all the way to the top, but one down. And then make sure that your sleeves are rolled down and buttoned. And don't tuck the legs of your pants into your boots, because that's a spot where molten metal can collect and do damage. And keep in mind that you're not supposed to wear any synthetic clothing. All of your clothing needs to be 100% cotton whenever you're working around molten metal of any kind. There's some factors that promote explosions, and moisture, ice, or water on any of your charge materials is probably the #1 way. If you're charging directly into a furnace and it's got anything more than 0 heel, then that's where you come into the potential for splashing or getting an explosion. There's other contaminants, and that's the presence of, say, if a bottle or a can of something gets into a furnace, it can explode. And then things like even the furnace temperatures being too high can be a factor. Unpreheated tools, you saw in the video where the guy looks like he stabbed into some molten metal with a pry bar, and he had automatically got an explosion, and that's probably from not having preheated that pry bar. Alright, how do we prevent explosions? It's always, number one thing is I think to inspect the charge materials that you're going to be charging into the furnaces. Make sure that they're free of moisture or ice. Make sure that there's no contaminants, no ink pens, no water bottles. Where I worked just previously for Reynolds Aluminum, we had to be very careful about what we were bringing in on these trucks, because they would come in on a flatbed truck in the rain, in the snow, and sometimes people had a really bad habit of taking water bottles or soda bottles and wedging them into the steel banding that was holding the ingots together. And if that were to get into the furnace, then that would be very likely an explosion event. And of course, we're talking about preheating tools, properly bedding our furnaces. It's always best policy to make sure that we got zero heel in our furnaces, and then keep control of our furnace temperatures and follow your SOPs and to make sure that you're following all the rules to the T. Here's an interesting picture on a pig of aluminum, and that's a shrinkage crack. And sometimes when this material would come into us, and this is at the aluminum plant that I worked at previously, that's just a big crater here. You can kind of see the depression that goes around, and there's a cavity in there that could potentially be holding water, and that's stuff that we have to look out for. So we talked about looking for bottles and cans in or on the charge material. We have to store this stuff properly, handle it properly, and then yeah, pretty much everything that we've covered already has been repeated there. And let's see. And it's always a good policy, if you're charging ingots, make sure that that you're placing those ingots just inside the furnace door and not actually dumping them directly into the molten metal. That's where you get the splashes. Let's see. We talked about preheating tools, zero heel. Let's see. And avoid charging material directly into molten metal by hand. Not only is that an ergonomic issue, but that's also, of course, a splash issue as well. And we need to keep in mind, cans, bottles, and aerosols, they really shouldn't be allowed in areas where molten metal is present because of the potential for the explosions at that point. All right, and last slide here. Report promptly to your supervisor any indication of leaking gas, whether it's from tanks, cylinders, pipes, or fittings. Make sure, of course, that you're monitoring your metal furnaces at least every hour. And last thing, it's probably not a good idea to stand directly in front of a melting furnace when that door is up, because if anything happens and you happen to be in the line of fire, then you could be injured that way. So that's molten metal, and I thank you for your time and for your attention.